The Department of Public Enterprises says that Eskom has spent almost 65 billion rand on diesel in the past 5 years. This was revealed by Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan in a recent parliamentary response. Gordhan said Eskom has increasingly relied on diesel to power its open-cycle gas turbines to plug the electricity generation gap. Now, let's unpack this further with energy expert Clyde Mallinson. Clyde, thank you so much for joining us on News at Prime on this Friday evening. We've all been quite elated with no load shedding, but of course, many are skeptical that this is merely an election ploy. Now, we know that Eskom has been spending more and more on diesel. What are your concerns when it comes to this approach?
Good evening. Well, the truth is Eskom actually spent less on diesel in April than they did last year. And they also spent less on diesel in April than they did in January, February and March. So I'm not quite sure where the story about how much they spent on diesel in specifically April emanates from, because anyone can check it. You can go onto the Eskom data portal and see how much they spent on diesel in April, and you'll see that it was less than in January, February or March.
Sorry to just come in there, Clyde. I'm just speaking on an annual basis. If we're looking at those numbers that the minister actually also revealed in Parliament, if we're looking at 2020, that financial year, it was 5.8 billion rand spent on diesel. The following year was 5.75, and now we're sitting at 24 billion rand. I think it's more the macro look at it as opposed to just on a monthly basis.
Sure. Look, the amount spent last year, in other words, 2023, was the highest amount ever.
Yeah.
And it's important to understand that it was actually quite a bit more than 24 billion. 24 billion was what Eskom spent on running their own open cycle gas turbine fleet. Now, in addition to their fleet, they also purchased electricity from 2 open cycle gas turbine plants that are IPPs, or independent power producers. And they buy about half as much power from them, or those 2 independent power producers produce another 50% on top of what Eskom spend on their own OCGT. So it's correct to say Eskom spent about 24 billion on their OCGTs, but they spent about another 12 billion on IPP. So we were closer to 35, 36 billion in the last year. And it's really this year where there's a lot of discussion at the moment about the dropping off in load shedding running up to elections. And the truth is that we haven't spent as much money on diesel in April as what we spent in January, February or March this year. And we've spent significantly less than we spent last year in April. So I'm not sure where the stories are emanating from.
Again, Clyde, I think it's more on the macro perspective, on an annual, looking at the annual budgets, that it has tripled in just, 3 or 4 years. But just to go back to your point, moving from that, what do you then account this to? Because many are skeptical. You can't blame South Africans for being skeptical. We have almost gotten to a norm of living with load shedding, and then suddenly there's absolutely no load shedding whatsoever when we're going from stages 4 to 6 and alternating between those not so long ago. So what can we attribute this reprieve to?
I think the thing we need to look at is why we had so much load shedding in January, February and March, because last year, which was our worst year ever, on average, we had about, let's call it 2 stages of load shedding, about 1.8 gigawatts or 1,800 megawatts of shortfall on average last year, which means that sometimes we had stage 6 when we were short of 6,000 megawatts, and other times we had 0. But the average was 2,000 megawatts. Now, this year, we've had return to service of 1,800 megawatts from Kusile. That was not available for most of last year. And in addition to that, our demand this year is 1,400 megawatts less than it was last year. So we've kind of got close to 5,000 megawatts of extra ammunition, or 4,000 megawatts. So the surprise really is that we still had load shedding in January, February, and March. Not that we haven't got load shedding in April. And the answer to that is probably that we did more maintenance in January, February, and March. Then we always do more maintenance in the summer months. And we've pulled back on planned maintenance here, perhaps a little bit earlier than we normally do, because we normally expect higher demand in the winter months. And because we're running into the winter months, then Eskom tends to do less planned maintenance in winter than it does in summer. So we at a position now where we've got sufficient energy resources to not have to have load shedding. And it's the combination of reduced demand as well as the fact that we've added 1,800 megawatts from Kusile. And then on to top it all, we're doing less planned maintenance at the moment in the run up to winter. So the surprise in a funny sort of way is that we still had load shedding in January, February, and March. It's not that surprising that we don't have load shedding in April now, because the numbers match. Our supply is matched by our demand is able to be met by the supply that Eskom have at their disposal.
So, Clyde, should we then see more load shedding when the demand is increased, of course, in winter? We shouldn't see this as being cynical that, you know, it's after the elections and purely that it's actually that the demand is now increased. Is that how we should be looking at it?
Yeah, I think what we should be a bit puzzled as to why we didn't stop having load shedding in January, February, and March, because it's no good not having load shedding when you're so close to elections. If you want to use it as a specific election ploy, you'd think that you would start implementing no load shedding or getting to a position where there was no load shedding, perhaps earlier, to say, look, you know, we fixed it. So I think it's just a coincidence of events. I don't think it's specifically Eskom. They're certainly spending less on diesel in April than they did in March, for example. So that's not the reason. The really important thing, though, is that while we're in this this window of opportunity where we're not having load shedding, we shouldn't really be patting ourselves on the back. We should be saying, right, let's get to work and put more new generation capacity on the grid. Let's build wind, let's build solar, let's build storage, so that we can revert to the schedule of gradually shutting down the coal fleet as we had committed to, instead of saying, oh, we're keeping the coal fleet going in order to avert load shedding. We should use this window of opportunity to build new generation resources that we need desperately. And remember, the coal fleet is scheduled to be decommissioned. I'm not saying we must shut it down sooner. I'm just saying we should stick to the time when it's due to be decommissioned. Give it a respected or respectful burial, if you like, after it's worked for us for 60 years or whatever.
And continues to.
And that's what we should, and that's what we should use this opportunity for. So it shouldn't be an opportunity to gloat. It should be seen as an opportunity to roll up our sleeves and increase the capacity of the transmission grid and build more wind, solar, and in particular storage as fast as we can, to allow us then to let the coal fleet be decommissioned on schedule.
Clyde, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I really appreciate your insights. That's energy expert Clyde Mallinson, who was joining us.